let me introduce our author. Christopher D. O'Sullivan is the author of FDR and The End of Empire, The Origins of American Power in the Middle East. He's also the author of Colin Powell, American Power and Intervention from Vietnam to Iraq, and Sumner Wells, Post-War Planning and the Quest for a New World Order. He teaches history at the University of San Francisco, was a recent Fulbright visiting professor at the University of Jordan, and delivered the keynote address at the UN's 60th anniversary session. He received his BA in history from the University of California, Berkeley, and his PhD in history from the University of London, London School of Economics. Let's welcome our author.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you coming to this session because I realize there's a lot of competition. So it means a lot to me that you're here. Okay? And I want to thank the staff of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and some former staff. Paul Marks is here. It's really a lovely opportunity to come back. It's sort of the culmination of this whole process that sort of begins as the seed corn of doing the research here years ago. And you always look forward to coming back and being able to talk about the book. And I always look for opportunities to write about FDR because there's really nowhere in the world, trust me, where it's nicer to do research than Hyde Park. Well, our story begins, appropriately enough, on Valentine's Day, 1945. President Roosevelt had arranged a Valentine's Day date with the King of Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud. And Saud and Roosevelt met on American worship in the Great Bitter Lake in Egypt. This was a very important summit meeting. It came only a few days after Roosevelt met with Churchill and Stalin at his last Big Three conference at Yalta. And Roosevelt had been looking forward to this throughout the war. He developed a fascination with the King of Saudi Arabia, with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm sure not just for abstract reasons having to do with Saudi Arabian culture, but Saudi Arabia has a very important commodity under its soil. And this commodity had really been demonstrated as being profoundly important to the mechanized industrial warfare of the Second World War. And the Americans were interested in obtaining access, maintaining access to Saudi oil, both during the war and after. But Roosevelt was an old hand at meeting all kinds of foreign leaders. And he had very good manners when he met foreign leaders. Other wartime leaders, Winston Churchill, for example, wasn't always friendly to foreigners. Winston Churchill did not like Chiang Kai-shek. He did not like Madam Chiang Kai-shek. He was often reluctant to meet with people of color from places like the Middle East. Roosevelt had no compunctions about this. He really wanted to win over the Saudi king, realizing that, as he'd been told by the State Department, this was the person you need to see, the person you need to deal with. So Roosevelt brought some gifts. Very important to the Saudi king, a transport plane. Saudi Arabia was, in 1945, pre-industrial. I believe it had only one paved road in the entire country. So a plane was better than a Jeep, perhaps, under those circumstances. But the Saudi king asked Roosevelt during their summit meeting, he said, you're a very fortunate man. You get to be wheeled around in this wheelchair all the time. I wish my retainers would wheel me around in a wheelchair. And Roosevelt said, well, that could be arranged. So he gave the Saudi king his second best wheelchair, which was quite a gesture. There was some concern in the White House and in the State Department that King Ibn Saud might also give Roosevelt some controversial, politically incorrect gifts. Roosevelt was briefed by the State Department that if the king offered him an Arab wife, he'd better say no. Mrs. Roosevelt might have something to say about that. Also, it was revealed on the ship's manifest that the Saudi king was bringing 10 slaves with him. The Americans felt sort of ambivalent about this. The king said there was no way he was going to travel to meet President Roosevelt inside the ship. So they arranged to have tents put on the top of the ship. They brought live animals that they could slaughter during the trip there. The king also had been advised by the American minister in Saudi Arabia, Colonel William Eddy, not to bring his traveling harem. This might also create misunderstandings. I assume the biggest problem Roosevelt had was not a cultural one, but had to do with his really severe addiction to nicotine. He was told not to drink. That was okay as long as it wasn't 6 o'clock. But also not to smoke in the presence of the Saudi king. Why was this meeting so important? Well, Roosevelt arranged this behind Winston Churchill's back. Churchill said, if you're going to meet Saudi, I want to be there too. It has to be a tripartite meeting. Roosevelt said, no way. I want to meet with him alone. This is going to form a new special relationship with Saudi Arabia. So that close relationship, for better or worse, that we have today, the seed of that was very much planted during the Second World War. And part of this is part of Roosevelt's larger strategy of trying to drive a wedge between the Arabs and the British. The Arabs desperately wanted the British out of the region. The Americans recognized this. The Americans saw the war as an opportunity to cultivate Arab leaders like King Saud in Saudi Arabia, like King Farouk in Egypt, like the new Shah of Iran, the Shah that we came to know, overthrown in the 1970s, and also the baby king in Iraq and his regent who looked after him. My book reveals that there was much more discord and conflict between the British and Americans than most of us previously understood. And you really have to look to the colonial world at this conflict. Tremendous conflict over India, and particularly in 1942, and in the Middle East throughout the entire war. The Americans believed that there would be a new order in the Middle East after the war. That the European empires, the British Empire in particular, but the French Empire as well, would fall by the wayside, and the Americans wanted to be prepared for this. So there were profound differences between Roosevelt and Churchill over the Middle East that came out during the war. Churchill, on the other hand, actually believed that the war offered an opportunity for the British to enlarge upon their domain in the Middle East. There may have been some rationality to this. Remember, in the First World War, the British and French had obtained large territories, Syria and Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Transjordan, from the disintegrating Ottoman Empire. So there was hope that that might even be enlarged upon, or even British control within each country might be tightened further. For example, the one country that existed in sort of a netherworld during that period, that was not formally a colony, but also was not de facto independent, was Iran. The British had designs during the war to include Iran, to envelop Iran into this system of informal empire. And the Americans wanted to avoid this occurring. Roosevelt, from very early in the war, understood that the people of the colonial world wanted freedom and independence. This was embodied in the August 1941 Atlantic Charter, which Roosevelt, in a sense, forced upon Winston Churchill in Britain's moment of peril. The British really didn't like this. Churchill, in particular, you may remember that he said he had not become the king's first minister to oversee the decline of the British Empire. But he was going to have to make concessions in the acceptance of American aid. Roosevelt felt that decolonization, that the end of empire was absolutely inevitable. And to stand in the way of that was to be on the wrong side of history. During the war, the Americans thought, decades after this war is over, China, which was not formally a colonized country, but had certainly been mistreated in the previous century by outside powers, including Japan, but also the Europeans, China would emerge as a great power. By fits and by starts, perhaps, but ultimately it was inevitable. India would start to emerge as a great power. Who are India's friends going to be in the world in 20 years? Certainly not someone who stood in the way of what FDR saw as India's inevitable independence. Winston Churchill resented this deeply, that the Americans were interfering in imperial affairs like this. Let me explain to you how Roosevelt saw the American approach to the Middle East as different from the British approach. Roosevelt felt, and I think it's interesting for us today, here we are 2013, the Arab Spring was a couple of years ago, you probably heard the news from Egypt today. The Middle East is still in turmoil, but a lot of it has to do certainly with the past and even the recent past. Roosevelt felt that the American moment in the Middle East could be different from the British moment. How? Well, his assessment and the assessment of his advisors, people who were advising him, like Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles, his Chief State Department people on the Middle East desk, and his ministers and ambassadors in the Middle East region itself. The idea was that the European powers had largely exploited the Middle East, extracted their resources, had toyed with their cultures and societies, had socially re-engineered these countries, and really left nothing in return. Roosevelt said, we will need those resources too, but how can we do it in a way that has a greater degree of consent? Perhaps there needs to be reciprocity. This is a very sort of political doctrine, idea of being like a politician, horse trading with someone, or maybe it's camel trading, I'm not sure, but finding what that person wants, you want something from him, and making a trade, and both sides are relatively satisfied with this. So FDR's approach to the region was based on the concept of reciprocity. If we're going to have relations with the Saudis, what will the Saudis get out of us other than us just sucking their oil out of the desert? Well, we can develop Saudi Arabia. We can provide them with money. We can provide them with advisors. We can have, as some American officials said, a new deal for the Middle East. American officials talked about a Tennessee Valley Authority for the Jordan River, for the Nile River, for the Tigris and Euphrates, to develop the Middle East, to build the Middle East up, and to create a middle class, to build institutions of health and education. So that was the goal. The Americans feared that if we went in, extracted the resources, and only cut deals with the elites of these specific countries, the problems would just continue. That there was definitely a separation between the elite leadership of these countries and the masses of people who had basically nothing. Roosevelt also saw the relationship with Saudi Arabia as being a kind of model for the rest of the Middle East. Now, FDR often thought this way during the war. Think about it. What can you think of? What was the role model that Roosevelt presented to people like Churchill during the war and said, look what we've done in the Philippines. Look what we've done in the Philippines. Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1935. We pledged to free the Philippines within 10 years. We're on that roadmap. You need to do the same thing for your colonies. You need to prepare them for genuine independence. So the Philippines stood as an important example of America's commitment to not be an imperial power after the war, that we would not take countries by conquest. Even countries we had taken by conquest, like the Philippines, would be prepared for independence and fast track to freedom. So Roosevelt said this was a good example for the British and French Empire. In the Middle East, he made Saudi Arabia an example. He said, look, we have a 50-50 deal on the oil with the Saudis. We want to develop them, we want to help them, we want to give them aid, we want to build hospitals and roads, whatever they need. We need to make sure that the Saudi people are getting something in return. Now, Churchill saw through this immediately. This was deeply destabilizing to the British and French traditions in the Middle East, because the British have been extracting resources from both Iraq and Iran, largely petroleum, without this level of reciprocity. The Iraqis and Iranians, not the elites who were working with the British, but the people, the middle class people, the other people living in society, were very aggrieved by this. They were receiving nothing in return. This set a very dangerous example, because the Iranians and the Iraqis began looking to Washington and saying, that's where the honey is. That's where you can cut a deal with the Americans where everybody benefits, whereas we're not getting a great deal from the British. So this became very alarming to the British during the war, the possibility that the Americans had established this example in Saudi Arabia, which would destabilize their hold on other places. I mentioned FDR's advisors a minute ago, and I just want to point out a couple of figures you may not have heard of. Certainly the high-ranking officials in Washington, such as Secretary Hull, Sumner Welles, are fairly well known. But the people who Roosevelt selected to be ministers, sort of de facto ambassadors in the Middle East, were also a remarkable group of people. In Egypt, you had a man named Alexander Kirk. Kirk was a longtime political appointment, was very, very savvy about trying to discern the needs of the Egyptian people. Kirk was very, very critical of the British presence in Egypt, particularly the British ambassador there, Sir Miles Lamson. Sir Miles Lamson had been High Commissioner in Egypt. He later transitioned into being the ambassador. This is kind of a bad mix. If you've been functioning as High Commissioner over a country, and then you're suddenly ambassador, it's very hard to be an ambassador when you've been High Commissioner. He continued to function as High Commissioner. Lamson said, policy will be made in the embassy, not in the Egyptian parliament. We will determine who will be prime minister. So the British embassy continued to run Egypt, and the Americans understood this. So the Americans began to try to cultivate and curry favor with King Farouk, who was increasingly despondent and aggrieved at the treatment meted out to him. In Iran, I think this deserves special notice. The American minister to Iran was a man named Louie Dreyfus. Louie Dreyfus, to me, is a hero that Americans have never heard of. Dreyfus was so concerned about the plight of the Iranian people during the war that when the British provoked a famine, deliberately provoked a famine, in order to pressure Iranian officials to do London's bidding, Dreyfus cabled Washington and said, we need to find emergency wheat to send to Iran. We need to let the Iranians know that we are not a party to this policy of forced starvation or manufacturing famine in Iran. So Dreyfus worked overtime trying to bring this to the attention of officials in Washington, bring this to the attention of the president, who perhaps would talk to the British ambassador and say, this is completely uncalled for. This is not the way to go about trying to win the hearts and minds of the Iranians. Interesting story. We had so few speakers of Arabic in America at that time that whoever spoke Arabic, we basically relied upon. We recruited them for the Foreign Service and said, we need Arabic speakers. So many of the diplomatic officials in the Middle East during the war were the sons of missionaries who'd been in the Middle East. We found that a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps named William Eddy, who was the child of missionaries, spoke Arabic. So Roosevelt took this lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps and made him our first ever minister or ambassador to Saudi Arabia. So he went from lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps to being a de facto ambassador because Roosevelt said he speaks Arabic. He's also a military officer. He said maybe that'll appeal to Ibn Saud and some of the men around him. So Eddie was sent out there. So when you see that famous picture of Roosevelt meeting Ibn Saud on the American ship, the man on his knees interpreting is this Marine officer who became the U.S. ambassador. So you can see how hard up we were for Arabic speakers, that anyone we could find, even lower-ranking American military officers, as long as they spoke Arabic, they were useful to us. Let's talk about Iraq for a minute, since Iraq has been so much in our minds and in the news in the last decade. In Iraq, in 1941, the British moved to overthrow the Iraqi Prime Minister Rashid Ali, who the British perceived as being pro-Axis. This created a real dilemma in Washington. State Department officials were not convinced of Rashid Ali's Axis sympathies. They were convinced that he was a somewhat independent-minded, anti-British Iraqi official. They suspected this was the real reason why the British were moving to overthrow him. But he was overthrown in the spring of 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor. The Americans weren't in the war yet, so we didn't feel that we had any leverage to really say much about this. Rashid Ali was overthrown, and the pro-British faction of the Regent of Iraq and Prime Minister Nuri Said were brought back. Think about this for a second. How much legitimacy or credibility do Arab politicians have when they're put back into power by outside countries? It's maybe something we should have considered in the last decade. But the credibility of these officials were often shredded by receiving such obvious support from the British. The big area where this was tested immediately was Egypt. America was now in the war as of December 41. And in January and February 42, the British moved to overthrow King Farouk of Egypt. I've found the documents that the British planned very harsh overthrow. They said, we won't kill him, but we do want to make him as miserable as possible. So where would be the most unpleasant place to send the king of Egypt? Let's send him to Canada and see how he likes the winters there. So So they were going to put him into exile and send him to Canada. The Americans sensed this and tried to get a message to Farouk saying, we don't agree with what the British are doing. We don't agree with the pressure they're putting on you. They're trying to overthrow you. We want you to know that we can have a partnership with you. We can have a friendship. Farouk outsmarted the British at the last minute, preserved his throne, at least for another 10 years. But it raises an interesting question. With the British siding with a particular Egyptian political party, the Waqf Party, imprisoning most of the Egyptian opposition, pressuring Farouk, delegitimizing Farouk to some extent by making him look weak. The British were sort of eliminating numerous legs of the three-legged stool they had in Egypt. It's hard to have a one-legged stool. And this is basically what the British were left with, their own power in Egypt. So the Americans said, Egypt doesn't have any oil, but it's a very important country in the Middle East. Its proximity to the Suez Canal. It's the most populous Arab country in the Middle East. Let's move in and let the Egyptians know that we want a friendship, we want an alliance with them. Problems arose immediately. Who do you form these alliances with? The British had long formed these alliances with the elites of Egyptian society. The Americans said, these people are somewhat discredited. Why don't we pump development aid into Egypt and develop Egypt along the lines of what the New Deal did for this country during the Great Depression? We'll build infrastructure. And in the process of doing that, we'll create a class of technocrats, of technocratic experts and engineers and people with university degrees, and those people will be our allies. And the British will be stuck with these discredited elites. What happened was, a lot of these Middle Eastern societies were structured in ways that it was very hard to create a middle class overnight. And the Americans were looking for a new, educated, pro-Western, technocratic middle class to form a relationship with. Well, that didn't happen immediately. And the Americans soon found, both near the end of the war and after the war, that we were in bed with the same discredited elites in most of these countries. I think this is a very important point to emphasize. Because our closeness, look at Egypt for an example. Our closeness to Egypt created a chasm between the mass of the Egyptian people and the elites who were actually benefiting from close Western contact and investment. And we've never really been able to reconcile it. I mean, we still have that problem in Egypt today, don't we? I mean, we're dealing with elites and regimes and governments, but the Egyptian people don't feel well represented, and they don't really see themselves as being loved by the American government. They see their regimes as being loved by the American government. This effort to cultivate Middle Easterners went so far as Roosevelt invited 2 of King Saud's sons to America during the war. I won't tell you how many sons King Saud had, but these were only 2 of many. And they came to Washington, they toured the country. These poor guys, they really wanted to go to Hollywood and, I don't know, see starlets or something. But Roosevelt said, no, don't waste your time in LA. They can have one day there, but he said, take them out to West Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. Show them what can be done with arid terrain, with drip irrigation and hydraulic engineering. And these poor princes, they didn't want to spend their whole trip in West Texas, but Roosevelt said, no, they've got to go home and spread the word about what can be done. So I'm not really sure how successful this visit was, but the King of Saudi Arabia really very much deeply appreciated that Roosevelt had taken the time to host his sons and to give them a tour of America. In Iran, consider that Roosevelt was working from, in his mind, examples from the past, and even from his own presidency. So when he looked at the Middle East, in some ways, it was inevitable that he'd think of Latin America, which was the region that he had the most experience with during his first couple of terms, the good neighbor policy. He made several goodwill tours down there. So Roosevelt thought, well, we'll have a good neighbor policy for the Middle East. And what that means is I have to form close bonds of friendship with specific leaders. I should meet Farouk before the war is over. And in fact, he did at the same time he met King Saud of Saudi Arabia. I should meet the Shah of Iran. He did in December 1943. I should get to know these people, form relationships with them. Remember, Roosevelt always had perhaps an outsized belief in his ability to seduce and persuade people. And he was convinced if he could meet these leaders one-on-one, without the unnecessary distraction of Churchill, that he could really form a connection with them. I think it's very interesting. I don't know how many people know this, but when FDR died at Warm Springs on April 12, 1945, a delegation of high-ranking Iraqis, including the Prime Minister and the Regent, were in Washington, waiting for him to return to have their photo op, to have their moment in the sun with the president as well. So this unfortunately never happened, and in all of the distractions that occurred with the president's death, they didn't end up meeting President Truman either. But it fascinates me that the Iraqis were waiting in Washington in their hotel for the president to come back from Warm Springs. Finally, I couldn't leave, I couldn't finish without saying something about one of Roosevelt's least favorite figures in the Second World War, other than the Axis leaders, of course, his antagonist, General Charles de Gaulle, the Free French. De Gaulle agreed to invade Syria and Lebanon in the summer of 1941, mostly British forces, but the British tried to make it look like a Free French operation, to overthrow the Vichy administrators in the Levant and replace them with Free French. The Americans were sort of worried about this. Since the French were sort of the weak power in the Middle East, everybody always kicked the French around and said, you have to do this, do as we say, not as we do. So the British convinced the French, they said, if we invade Syria and Lebanon, you will immediately announce independence for Syria and Lebanon. And the Free French said, sure, that sounds good. But once the invasion happened and the Vichy authorities were overthrown, de Gaulle inevitably changed his mind. He said, we may be here indefinitely. And for a while, Churchill and Roosevelt were together. Churchill said, I can't believe that de Gaulle betrayed me. He gave me his word he was going to give Syria and Lebanon independence. But de Gaulle, I think, rightfully said to Churchill, why don't you give your colonies independence? Why do I have to give Syria and Lebanon independence? Why don't you free Jordan and Iraq and Palestine and Egypt? And Churchill said, we're not talking about that. We're talking about facts. So Churchill and Roosevelt were together for a while, but de Gaulle was a very, very clever man. He came up with an idea, a formula for Syria and Lebanon, for what I would call fake independence. De facto dominion status still, but proclamation of independence which would be similar to what the British were already enjoying in Iraq and Egypt. The British could hardly say no to this. So the British said, that's good enough for us. And Roosevelt, the American, said, it's not good enough for us. So we were put in this very strange predicament where through the war, the Free French were saying, we're giving Syria and Lebanon independence. Will America recognize them? And the Americans said, no, because we don't believe it's real independence. So we weren't recognizing Syria and Lebanon. The British and French immediately did. And we said, we're holding out for real, genuine independence. So you can see there was a lot of fighting beneath the surface. In my previous book about Sumner Wells, I called this the war within the war. Because there was a struggle within the war, particularly between Roosevelt and Churchill and numerous British officials and American officials, over the disposition of the colonial empires both during the war and after. It had profound and tremendous consequences for both how the war was fought and what happened later on. I know that Ken Burns and Jeffrey Ward are coming out with a series on Vietnam in a couple of years. Jeffrey Ward was here this last week, and he said that one thing he wants to emphasize is Roosevelt's commitment during the war to, quote, as Roosevelt said, French Indochina will not go back to the French. Well, we know that it did. And we know that years after the French departed in 1954, we, in a sense, filled the breach there. So one wonders how the post-war period would have developed had we remained on the side, as Roosevelt perceived it, on the side of the peoples of the colonial world, rather than resisting what he thought was this inevitable movement, this inevitable tide toward freedom and independence. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Story about Roosevelt's attitude as far as the Near East. I think about what happened in President Mossadegh Iran. It was the major reason because the Cold War, the Dulles brothers, Trump's good, Roosevelt's good intentions.
Yes. It's fascinating that in 1953, our intelligence services were participating in an effort to overthrow the Prime Minister of Iran, where during the war, we had in a sense made clear to the British that the policy was work with the people who were there, stop regime changing, to use a later parlance. We thought it was very bad for the medium and long-term relations of the region. Remember, I think we sometimes forget that in the spring of '41, the British overthrew Rashid Ali, the Prime Minister of Iraq. In the summer of '41, they and the Free French invaded Syria and Lebanon and threw out not only the Vichy administrators, but the Lebanese and Syrian politicians they had selected there. In the late summer of '41, the British and the Soviet Union overthrew the first Shah, the Shah of Iran, the previous Shah of Iran. In February 1942, they sought to overthrow King Farouk. I mean, this is a pretty big house cleaning of all of the leaders in the region. And if you look at their histories, most of these people had been selected by the British in the first place. You know, the British had worked collaboratively with Farouk. They thought he was someone they could do business with. They created the first Shah of Iran. He didn't really have any legitimacy. He was put in because the British felt that they could work with him. So I would say that our Middle East policy in the 1950s, pursuing this regime change in Iran, for example, is very much out of sync with what we were producing in the early 40s. But do keep in mind, I mean, I'm not here to talk about Eisenhower, but Eisenhower's foreign policy in the Middle East is extraordinarily complex. And Eisenhower's decision not to go into the breach in '56 at Suez, when our allies, the British and French, were colluding with the Israelis to attack Egypt, quite possibly is one of the most savvy and genuinely positively conservative decisions by an American president of the 20th century. Yeah.
I'm just interested in your analysis of de Gaulle, and I was curious if his strategy with Syria and Lebanon was, you know, I'm curious, I think Algeria was a concern in his mind, and whether that was a move to not give the Algerians ideas or whether it gave them ideas.
Absolutely. Good point. The French, like the British, but your question's about the French, but it applies to both, always felt with regard to empire that anything you did, any concessions you made anywhere in the empire established a bad precedent for other parts of the empire. So you're absolutely right. De Gaulle felt in his mind that if we give too many concessions to the Levantine Arabs, to Syria and Lebanon, what does this mean for Algeria? What does this mean for Tunisia? Which was much more important to the French, of course, than the Levant. And it applied to the British as well. I mean, the British felt the Americans were setting a bad enough example in the Middle East, right? Coming in and saying reciprocity. Let's make everybody happy. The British are saying, no, you know, this is bad. You can't do this. This is going to undermine the basic premise of the empire. So you do get to eventually to a level of absurdity, though. I mean, Syria and Lebanon to the French are not really important in and of themselves, right? But they become profoundly important because the example they might set for other parts of the French Empire that are important. Yes, sir.
Question about repeating patterns. It seems that, I've heard this before, that the idea of evolving a middle class within any sort of a culture, you have the haves at the top and what's at the bottom, is our theory that, well, things will work out if we can create a middle class no matter what the culture is. How is this going to, or how did this play out in the Middle East in the past and now, when in many of these cultures, half of them, i.e. the females, are disenfranchised? They can't drive, they can't walk, they can't that. Is it possible to evolve a middle class with half of your society excluded?
I think in Roosevelt's mind, he looked at Latin America as a model, where in the early 20th century, you know, certainly different from the Middle East, but Latin American societies are very paternalistic also, very male-driven. Roosevelt, I think, felt that a lot of these Latin American countries were developing. Slowly, over time, a consumer society was developing in these countries, a middle class was developing, and I think we made the culturally anthropological mistake of thinking that what was happening slowly in Latin America was applicable to other regions of the world. I also think to some extent this mistake was made with regard to China. Because although I've always understood the larger reasons for the China policy during the war, that it was profoundly important to tie down so many hundreds of Japanese divisions in China throughout the war, not to be redeployed to the Pacific, God forbid. But our idea is that China, within a relatively short period of time, would develop a large middle class and a consumer society. That ultimately has started to happen. I think President Roosevelt thought it was going to happen a lot sooner than it did. Maybe it would have had the revolution not occurred and Mao Zedong come to power. You look at what's happened in Taiwan at the same time. But I do think that we often make this mistake of looking for models. And Latin America was a model for almost everything we were doing in the Middle East. And in some cases it applied nicely, right? But in other cases, culturally they're so different that they were destined not to work out. Sir?
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned Roosevelt was very favorable during the war, made sure British, granted independence to India. As far as I know, our national leaders like Mahatma Gandhi or Nehru never came and maintained. So who was advising Roosevelt during the war on India policy?
Roosevelt understood that the first conflict occurred at the Atlantic Conference, and then a few months later when we signed something in December called the Declaration on the United Nations, Roosevelt antagonized Churchill by saying, make sure India signs this. And the British were saying, well, India's not really on the same level of the other, and Roosevelt really insisted. And then he very much antagonized the British by sending 2 envoys to India. First Louis Johnson in 1942, and then William Phillips in 1943. And these envoys were given the status of ambassador sent to India. And the British said, you can't send an ambassador to India. India is still, it's a unique entity. It's not formally a colony, but it's not. Yeah. So in terms of advice, I think Roosevelt felt that India was profoundly important to the Chinese. Chiang Kai-shek went to India during the war and visited Nehru when Nehru was under house arrest. This single photo, if you've ever seen it, of Nehru and Chiang Kai-shek talking in Nehru's bungalow, was probably the single photo that most disturbed and angered Winston Churchill during the entire war. It's one reason why Churchill from that point wanted to have very little to do with Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang Kai-shek. Have you all ever seen the photos from the Cairo conference? Where, I don't know if you know this story, but Roosevelt said, I think Chiang Kai-shek should come to the next Big 3, Big 4 conference. And Churchill said, absolutely not, no way. I'm not meeting with a Chinese leader. What will the Indians think? Next time I have to start meeting with all these people from Asia. So this wasn't going to happen. So it was kind of like a surprise. Roosevelt said, okay, calm down. I'm not inviting you to Tehran. But when they went to Cairo, Chiang Kai-shek was there. And Churchill, you see the photos of them sitting, and Madam Chiang Kai-shek is seated next to Churchill, and you can see her in almost every photo trying to start a conversation, and Churchill's sort of sitting there. You won't even really engage her. But I think China policy is very much linked to India, because China said the seriousness of the Allies will be what they do in India. Is Asia going to be different in the future, or is everyone just fighting Japan for no reason? Because remember, Roosevelt was deathly afraid when it came to Asia. He said, I don't think we should be fighting Japan merely to restore Asia to Europeans afterwards. And remember, with the exception of the war that was already going on in China, Japan attacked the American Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, British Hong Kong, British Malaya, Singapore, all of these, French Indochina before that, all these places had been European possessions. So there's a real linkage between China and India. In our effort to keep China on side, we wanted to send a gesture that we were committed to change in India during the war. Yes?
I'm sure you're aware of the conversation FDR had with the king about what would happen to the Jews in Palestine.
Yes.
It was a short conversation. What's your view of what FDR's agenda was on that issue? What would have happened if had he lived several more years, except what Truman did before you?
I think on this policy of FDR's vacillating, tacking back and forth on the issue of Palestine, he's not wrapping himself in glory on this issue. I do think that Roosevelt had a tendency to delay, to stall, to keep kicking the can down the road until some solution came up. In this case, he was dealing with an issue that in its seriousness and in the commitment of the different sides to that issue was different from a normal American political issue. I think FDR may have made the mistake to some extent of thinking that Ibn Saud was sort of like a recalcitrant American senator. You know, we'll build a dam in the state or something like this. We'll give him some developmental aid. It will assuage him, it will bring him around. But at the time, Roosevelt was being warned by his own State Department, who said, Mr. President, you're barking up the wrong tree. No Arab leader in the region is going to cut a deal with the Americans to populate Palestine with Jews, because that Arab leader will immediately lose their legitimacy. So you're not going to find someone to do this. Roosevelt was looking for a local leader to cut a deal with him. And his lower ranking official said, there's no way Ibn Saud at no price is going to be willing to do this. In fact, I've discovered, and it's in my book, that on the contrary, Colonel Eddy, who was the U.S. Minister Secretary, warned the president. He said, my fear, you know, I don't think Saud's ever going to cut a deal to populate Palestine with Jews. He said, on the contrary, I think there's a real fear that Saud will lead an Arab army at the end of the war to liquidate or massacre all the Jews that are in Palestine. That's a bigger concern that the local officials on the ground have. Other questions? Yes, sure.
Take something like David Frampton's book about the
Mhm.
First World War.
Yeah.
Comparing the two wars, which do you think have the best or worst influence in terms of the post-World War II history of the Middle East? I mean, you can't have one without the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like World War II did not change a lot of the lines that are now probably in, say, Iraq.
It did in this respect. You're absolutely right that World War I did determine the sort of underlying parcel map of these territories that would become states, because the British and French inherited so much of the Ottoman Empire and divided up amongst themselves as mandates. Where World War II is really important is, I'm not sure if independence would have come for the Middle East, or for other parts of Asia for that matter, when it did and under the circumstances it did without World War II. Because remember how profound it is that the British and French are so thoroughly discredited around the world, that their power is really shown to be a hollow shell to the Arabs, that the Arabs are now saying, we can taste it, independence is near. So I think it expedited independence, World War II. Any further? I think we're out of time. Thank you very much for coming.